A photograph leaked from Mar-a-Lago shows something that should make every Venezuelan sleep with one eye open tonight. Donald Trump and Elon Musk sitting across from each other in what appears to be a private dining room, with satellite imagery of Venezuelan oil fields spread across the mahogany table between them. Musk is holding what looks like a Starlink deployment map, while Trump points at specific coordinates along the Orinoco River basin. The timestamp on the image reads 11:47 p.m., 3 days before American naval forces began their largest Caribbean deployment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. If this meeting actually happened, we're not just watching the planning of an invasion, we're watching the privatization of war itself. And here's the part that'll keep you awake at night. In 1998, The Simpsons aired an episode where Mr. Burns acquired his own private satellite network to monitor global energy assets, while Marge worried about that nice South American family losing their home. The episode was called Oil in the Family, and Burns was seen shaking hands with a character who looked suspiciously like a cartoon version of a tech mogul in a black turtleneck. 25 years later, that handshake doesn't feel like comedy anymore. But let's talk about why this photograph matters, because the implications stretch far beyond Venezuela's borders. We're potentially witnessing the merger of American military power with private space technology, and the target isn't just Nicolas Maduro's government, it's the entire concept of national sovereignty in the age of satellite warfare. When the richest man on Earth can provide real-time battlefield intelligence from space, and the most powerful military force in history needs that intelligence to justify regime change, we've crossed into territory that international law never anticipated. The timing of this meeting is particularly interesting when you consider what was happening in global markets that week. Oil futures had been climbing steadily as OPEC announced production cuts. Bitcoin was experiencing one of its most volatile periods in months, and Tesla stock had mysteriously spiked 12% in after-hours trading, following unconfirmed rumors of a major South American partnership. Now, looking at this photograph, those market movements start to make a different kind of sense. Someone was positioning themselves for profits that could only come from advanced knowledge of geopolitical chaos. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, roughly 300 billion barrels. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than Russia. But here's what makes this different from every other American intervention since World War II. This time, the guy with the satellites gets to pick which pipelines get built, which refineries get protected, and which shipping routes stay operational. Musk doesn't just want to watch the invasion, he wants to own the infrastructure that makes the post-invasion economy possible. The political calculation here is brutally simple, and that's what makes it so dangerous. Trump needs a foreign policy victory that looks decisive without risking American casualties. Maduro's government has been isolated, sanctioned, and weakened for years. The Venezuelan military is demoralized, under-equipped, and frankly, tired of protecting a regime that can't even keep the lights on in Caracas. On paper, this looks like the kind of quick, clean regime change that American presidents dream about. But that's exactly what they said about Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syria. What makes this particularly sinister is the intelligence gap that's emerged over the past decade. Traditional CIA assets in Venezuela have been compromised, expelled, or eliminated. The NSA's signals intelligence has been hampered by Venezuelan government encryption and Russian technical assistance. But Musk's satellites don't need human assets or signals intelligence. They just need to point cameras downward and track movement patterns. It's surveillance without the messy complications of human intelligence. And it's surveillance that no Venezuelan counterintelligence operation is equipped to detect or disrupt.
What's different this time is the technology advantage. Musk's Starlink constellation can provide communication networks that Venezuelan forces can't jam, can't intercept, and can't destroy. His satellites can track every Venezuelan military movement in real time, can identify command structures, and can coordinate precision strikes with an accuracy that makes previous American interventions look like caveman warfare. But here's the uncomfortable question nobody's asking. If Musk can do this for the American military in Venezuela, what's stopping him from doing it to the American military if his interests ever diverge from Washington's? The economic implications are where this gets really twisted. Venezuela's economy has been in free fall for a decade, with inflation rates that make Weimar Germany look stable. The country that once had the highest standard of living in South America now has citizens eating zoo animals to survive. Any American intervention that promises to restore basic services, electricity, running water, functioning hospitals, will be welcomed by millions of Venezuelans who've been abandoned by their own government. But the cost of that restoration will be paid in oil concessions that last for generations. And guess who's positioning himself to build the infrastructure for those oil concessions? The same guy whose Tesla factories need lithium, whose SpaceX program needs rare earth metals, and whose Neuralink research needs political stability in regions where those resources are abundant. This isn't just regime change, it's vertical integration on a global scale. But there's another layer to this economic calculation that makes me genuinely uncomfortable. Venezuelan debt obligations currently total approximately $150 billion to various international creditors, including Chinese banks, Russian energy companies, and American bondholders who bought distressed Venezuelan securities at pennies on the dollar. If American forces successfully install a new Venezuelan government, those debt obligations don't disappear, they get restructured. And the person with the most leverage in those restructuring negotiations won't be the Venezuelan people or even the American government. It'll be the guy who provided the satellite intelligence that made regime change possible in the first place. Now let's talk about the technology warfare aspect, because this is where things get genuinely terrifying. Venezuelan air defenses are based on Russian S-300 systems from the early 2000s. They're designed to track aircraft, not satellite swarms. Musk's Starlink network operates at an altitude and frequency that Venezuelan military radar simply wasn't built to detect. If American forces coordinate their assault through Starlink communications, Venezuelan commanders will be fighting a war where they can't see their enemy's coordination, can't intercept their communications, and can't predict their movements. But here's the part that should scare everyone, including Americans. This technology doesn't have nationality. If Musk can use satellite networks to enable regime change in Venezuela, China can use satellite networks to enable regime change in Taiwan. If private companies can provide military intelligence that supersedes traditional intelligence agencies, then warfare becomes a subscription service. The country with the best satellite coverage wins, and the countries without satellite coverage become client states or rubble. The regional implications of this potential invasion extend far beyond Venezuelan borders. Brazil's government has been quietly positioning itself as a mediator in Venezuelan affairs, partly because Brazilian energy companies have significant investments in Venezuelan oil projects. A sudden American intervention that bypasses Brazilian diplomatic efforts would effectively signal that South American regional leadership is irrelevant when American corporate interests are at stake. Colombia, which has been dealing with Venezuelan refugees for years, would suddenly find itself hosting American military bases and becoming a staging ground for ongoing occupation operations. Mexico, despite its official neutrality, would face enormous pressure to support American operations while managing the political fallout from its own population, which tends to view American interventions with deep skepticism. The humanitarian calculation is where my optimism dies completely. Venezuelan refugees are already flooding into Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru. We're talking about over 7 million people who fled their country, the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. An American invasion, even a successful one, will create immediate chaos that sends another 2 or 3 million Venezuelans across borders that are already overwhelmed. The countries absorbing these refugees don't have the infrastructure, don't have the resources, and frankly, don't have the political will to handle that kind of human displacement. And here's the dark comedy of it all. The American military will probably succeed. Venezuelan resistance will collapse within weeks, Maduro will flee to Cuba or Russia, and American forces will secure the oil fields with minimal casualties. CNN will run victory footage of American soldiers distributing humanitarian aid to grateful Venezuelan families. Trump will hold a press conference declaring mission accomplished. Musk will announce plans for Venezuela's technological reconstruction using Tesla charging stations and Starlink internet. And 6 months later, we'll be dealing with Venezuelan insurgents who learned urban warfare from Iraqi and Afghan veterans funded by Colombian drug cartels who've lost their Venezuelan supply routes.
Remember that Simpsons episode I mentioned earlier? There was a scene where Homer accidentally triggered a nuclear alert while trying to fix the plant's communication system. The alarm sounded across Springfield, and everyone assumed it was a real attack. But the real joke wasn't the false alarm. It was that nobody in Springfield knew how to turn the alarm off. They just had to wait for it to stop ringing. Sometimes I wonder if Matt Groening was trying to tell us something about American foreign policy. There's another detail from that same Simpsons episode that I can't get out of my head. When the nuclear alert was finally canceled, Mr. Burns gathered his employees and announced that the communication disruption had been a valuable test of emergency protocols. He then promoted Smithers to Director of Crisis Coordination and gave him a bonus for maintaining operational security during an unplanned event. The episode ends with Burns and Smithers looking at a world map covered in red pins, while Burns mutters something about future testing opportunities in resource-rich regions. At the time, it seemed like typical Simpsons absurdity. Now it feels like a documentary. The what-if scenarios here are numerous, and none of them end well for anyone except defense contractors and satellite companies. Scenario 1. American forces succeed quickly, but Venezuelan oil workers sabotage the infrastructure before retreating, creating an environmental disaster that makes the Exxon Valdez spill look like a puddle. Oil prices spike globally, American gasoline hits $8 a gallon, and Trump's approval ratings crater, just as Venezuela becomes America's responsibility to rebuild. Scenario 2. American forces succeed quickly, but Chinese and Russian advisors evacuate Venezuelan leadership to Cuba, where they establish a government in exile that continues to control Venezuelan assets frozen in international banks. The new Venezuelan government can't access its own money, can't pay its own debts, and becomes completely dependent on American financial support, while Chinese and Russian proxies wage an insurgency that lasts for decades. Scenario 3, and this is the one that keeps me awake. American forces succeed quickly, and Musk's technology works so well that other countries decide they need their own private military satellite networks. Within 5 years, every major corporation with space capabilities is offering security services to the highest bidder. Warfare becomes privatized. International law becomes irrelevant, and nation-states become middle management between corporations and populations. But here's scenario 4, and it's the most likely. American forces succeed quickly. Venezuelan oil starts flowing again, gasoline prices drop, Americans forget about Venezuela entirely, and Musk quietly becomes the most powerful unelected person in South American politics. His satellites watch everything. His internet connects everyone.
His factories employ thousands, and his political influence determines which governments succeed and which governments disappear. And that brings us back to that photograph from Mar-a-Lago. If it's real, we're watching the moment when American foreign policy became a joint venture between the Pentagon and private industry. If it's fake, we're watching someone try to convince us that American foreign policy has already become a joint venture between the Pentagon and private industry. Either way, the message is the same. The age of nation-states is ending, and the age of corporate states is beginning. Here's what I think will actually happen, and I hope I'm wrong about every word of this. American forces will invade Venezuela within the next 6 months, probably under the pretext of humanitarian intervention or counter-narcotics operations. Maduro's government will collapse faster than anyone expects because Venezuelan military leaders have already been negotiating surrender terms through intermediaries. Musk will announce a comprehensive reconstruction plan that includes Starlink internet, Tesla charging infrastructure, and SpaceX transport logistics for oil shipments.
Venezuelan oil production will restart under American corporate management, but the profits will be used to pay for American military occupation, American corporate reconstruction, and American debt forgiveness for previous Venezuelan obligations. The Venezuelan people will get electricity and running water for the first time in years, but they'll pay for it with national sovereignty that their children will never recover. And 6 months after the invasion, when American attention has moved on to the next crisis, Venezuelan resistance groups will start targeting American corporate infrastructure, not the military bases, those are too well defended. The oil pipelines, the internet servers, the charging stations, the transport hubs. Because the same technology that made the invasion possible will make guerrilla warfare inevitable. So let me ask you this. Do you think this meeting between Trump and Musk actually happened? Because if it did, we're about to watch the blueprint for American intervention in the age of private space technology. And if it didn't happen, we're watching someone try to prepare us for that blueprint. Either way, Venezuelan independence ends when American satellites start watching. Here's another question. If Musk can coordinate regime change in Venezuela, what's stopping him from coordinating regime change anywhere? His satellites cover the entire planet, his internet reaches every continent, and his political influence spans multiple governments. At what point does a private citizen become too powerful for democratic oversight? And here's the question that'll determine everything. When this invasion happens, will you support it because Venezuelan people deserve better than Maduro, or will you oppose it because corporate warfare represents something fundamentally different from national defense? Because your answer to that question will determine how you feel about the next invasion, and the one after that, and the one after that. But here's the final twist that nobody saw coming, and it appeared just as I was finishing this analysis. Another photograph surfaced from the same Mar-a-Lago meeting, but this one shows a different angle of the room. On the wall behind Trump and Musk, barely visible unless you zoom in, is a framed still image from a Simpsons episode. It shows Mr. Burns standing over a map of South America, pointing at what looks suspiciously like the northern coast of Venezuela. The frame is signed, and although the signature is blurred, it looks remarkably like M. Groening. Sometimes the jokes stop being funny.